Okay, pop quiz. For anyone who grew up in church when you were really little, we used to sing a song and see if you can fill in the blank. Ready? Father Abraham, many sons had. Can anyone do the motions? And so are you. So let's praise the Lord, right arm. And then for some reason, and I have no idea what this song had to do with anything about Abraham. But all I know is we sang, Father Abraham had many sons, and then we would swing a right arm, and then we'd swing a left arm, and we'd sing a right leg, left leg, and then, nod your head, turn around, and sometimes we'd stick out our tongue. It was all kinds of weird motions. I'm pretty sure it was made for little kids like me who couldn't sit still. And some genius Sunday school teacher just came up with the song just to get all the wiggles out, okay? I'm not going to make us sing it this morning. I'm not going to make everyone get up and turn around and sit down. That was the end of it. In fact, now that I think about it, this was always the last song we sang right before the lesson. And the song always ended with, sit down, and we'd all sit down like this was the best thing, and then they would start teaching. Genius. Whoever made that was genius. Anyway, this morning, we're continuing in Genesis, and we get to the point where we get to begin to study this man named Abram, or as later was known as Abraham. The Father Abraham, the father of the Israelites, the father of the faith. In fact, he's well known. Many times he is called the father of faith, the one who basically started it all. However, as I read Abraham's life, because I always picture, especially as a kid, there was a couple stories that we would hit on Abraham. The first one is what we're going to look at today, is when Abraham was called. God came to Abraham, gives him his promise. We're going to look at it a little bit. And I just think, Abraham's like, okay, God, I'm going to follow you and do everything right. And he follows and does everything right. And then the next story I remember Abraham being called, and he says, okay. And then the next story I remember him is God saying, okay, Abraham, now you have to give up your son. And he says, and he obeys, which we'll probably look at a little bit later, but I always picture Abraham as being this perfect person of faith that never made any mistakes. And then as I read through Scripture, I realize that I think Abraham was probably a lot more like us, or like me. So this morning, we're going to begin to look at Abraham, Father Abraham, and just look at his life and what we can get from his life. And I got to warn you this morning, and I'm going to read 2 chapters in Genesis this morning, okay? So usually, I try to keep it to like a passage or 1 chapter or whatever. I'm going to try to do 2 chapters. In fact, this morning I was coming early and I always review my sermon. And I remember I was reviewing, I'm like, boy, I hope this isn't too much. But too bad. So this is what happened. Let me give you a background. We're going to start in Genesis chapter 12. If you want to turn to Genesis chapter 12. And let me give you a background of what has happened since we ended last week. Last week we looked at the flood. And after the flood, Noah and his family begin to multiply, and there's generations of people, and they built this city and this tower called Babel, and God actually ended up spreading the people all over the earth through that. That is where how all these nations everywhere was spread. And then after that, there were several generations, and in Genesis chapter 11 is just a really great read. When it starts talking about, okay, this generation did this, and so it gives us generations. And there's this man named Terah who had 3 sons, Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran had a son named Lot. Lot's father dies, And so his Uncle Abram, basically almost adopts Lot as his son because Abram and his wife could not have any children. And so that is where we pick up. Abram has basically adopted his nephew Lot as a son. Abram and his wife Sarai cannot have any children, and they're living in a foreign land that their father had moved them to. And this is what happens. The Lord said to Abram, "Leave your country, leave your people, your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you." This passage begins, and God says, Abram, I want you to leave. He just comes and says, leave, go. In fact, I'm not going to tell you where to go. I'm not going to tell you exactly. I just want you to leave, and then I'm going to show you where I want you to go. I will show you, and then I'm going to bless you. And there's going to be nations from you. In fact, there's this messianic promise right here at the end of this. At the end of verse 3, it's amazing. He says, all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. I find this amazing. I find all throughout Scripture that God has a plan. God has a plan, and He's always had a plan. And even in this promise to Abram, He says, listen, Abram, at this time, like one day, way in the future, from your lineage, I am going to save the world through Jesus Christ, my Son. The whole earth is going to be blessed. Salvation is going to come through Jesus. And He's going to be in your lineage. I'm going to bless all the peoples on this earth through you. So God says, go. In verse 4, it says this. So, Abram left. So Abram left, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. Martha, you've just got a couple years older than him, just a couple years on him. Abram left. God says, I want you to go, and Abram takes this step of faith and says, okay, I'm going to go. And this step of faith is so big. I don't think it can be undersold. Like, this was huge. It was about 6 years ago, 5.5, 6 years ago, where I packed my family up from West Virginia, and I said, and God called us to move to Greenville, Ohio. And let me tell you how hard it is to move from one place to another. It took us months of planning. We had to get a giant U-Haul. Not only do we have to get a giant U-Haul, but we had to get, we had 2 cars. I had to somehow maneuver my motorcycle in the back of the U-Haul so it doesn't fall out. That was the most important thing. And then we had to figure out where we're going to put our stuff when we got out here. We had to start looking for houses. It was stressful. It was hard. It was costly. And all I had was 3 kids, a wife, and a dog. That was it. Abraham, it says he took his wife, Sarai, he took his nephew Lot, he took all the possessions they had accumulated and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan when they arrived there. Look, Abraham had a wife, had Lot, had servants, had possessions, had flocks, had tents. They didn't get to rent a U-Haul. They didn't get to just drive for one day and unload. They traveled for a long time. They lived wherever they stopped. I'm sure they had food, but many times they probably had to pray for food or had to hope that there was food somewhere that they could buy or that they could catch or that they could kill or that they could make. This was huge, inconvenient, and it was a big step of faith. I always wonder what Abram's wife had said when he came up to her and said, hey, guess what, honey? We're going to move. God just came to me and said, we're going to move. And she's like, okay, where are we going to move to? I don't know. Well, how do we know when we get there? I don't know. How long is it going to take? I don't know. Well, what details do you have? God said go, and he's going to take care of it. And I'm sure she was probably thinking, why don't you just stop and ask for directions? Typical guy, right? If you'd have just asked God where to go, but no, somehow Abram trusted God. Somehow God came to Abram and said, I want you to go to a place where you don't know where you're going to go, and I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to provide for you. And Abram trusted God to fulfill his promise. It's that simple. And God said go, and Abram did. Now Abram traveled, in verse 6, Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh and Shechem. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give you this land. So this is basically, he's traveling, and all of a sudden the Lord appears to him and says, and he's like, halt, stop. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he went on towards the hill east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. So he travels, and in the middle of land, and this is where we find this is right in the middle of what we know as Israel. God stops him and he says, look, this is all yours. This is going to be yours. To your children and to their children and to the generations after. Now remember, Abram still didn't have any children at this time. So he camps there. He builds an altar, he worships God, and he camps there, and he waits. He waits for something to happen. And he waits some more. And he waits some more. You see, the thing about when we read Scripture, so many times we just go through it really quickly. We don't really understand that there's time that passes by in between sentences. I have no idea how much time passes by, but all I know is that he gets there, he sets up camp, and he's like, okay, everything is now going to be okay. Everything is going to be blessed. God is going to fulfill his promise. I did my part. Here comes God's promise. And he waits, and he waits, and he waits. Abram was ready for the promise to be fulfilled. But it doesn't happen. Something I've learned over the many years is that God's timeline is different than mine. God's timeline is so much different than ours. We expect instant results. God, if I obey, if I do this, then poof, instantly, whatever's supposed to happen is going to happen. God, I claim on your promise to this. If I do this, then poof, God, you're automatically going to do that because that's what you said is going to happen. And so many times God says, I just need you to wait. Trust me, I won't break my promise. But sometimes we need to wait. Abram sets up his tent. He's sitting there camping, and while he is waiting, while he's waiting on the Lord, a famine happens. Verse 10 says, now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. He couldn't wait any longer. A famine happens, and all of a sudden he's like, wait a minute, we are now, bad things are starting to happen, things are starting to go downhill, and so he doesn't wait any longer. He couldn't wait any longer, so he decides, you know what, I'm going to continue to move south. He started north, he went south, stopped, and God said, this is your land, and then the promise doesn't happen, and things start to go bad, and they start to lose food, and so they decide to keep going further south to Egypt. I want to make a side note here. Notice what didn't happen. God didn't say, Abram, move to Egypt. In fact, Abram, we don't find anywhere that it says Abram asked God, hey, God, should I move or should I stick this out? There's nowhere in here that indicates that Abram even thought about what God wanted. It just says there was a famine, so Abram decided on his own, I'm going to move to where there's food. Nothing indicates that Abram sought God's guidance. So Abram decides on his own, you know what, I'm going to go. It's hard right now. God, I'm waiting on your promise. It's not happening. It's hard. I'm going to go south to Egypt because there's food. In trouble. Because as he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife, who was, between 65 to 70 years old, and he says, you know what, I know what a beautiful woman you are. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife, and then they will kill me, but will let you live. He says, we're going to run into a problem because you're beautiful, and they're going to kill me, and they're going to marry you. So this is what I want you to do. Say you are my sister. I want you to lie. Say you're my sister so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. Abraham says, you're beautiful. I want you to lie so I don't die. So when Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians, they saw that she was a very beautiful woman, and the Pharaoh's officials saw her. They praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace, and he treated Abram, exactly what he said was going to happen. He treated Abram well for her sake, and Abram acquired sheep and cattle and male and female donkeys and maidservants and men servants and camels. So it almost looked like the lie worked. But the Lord inflicted serious disease on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarai. So Pharaoh summoned Abram. What have you done to me? He said. Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister so that I took her to be my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her, go, get out. And then Pharaoh gave orders about Abram to his men, and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything he had. Pharaoh realized problems begin in Egypt. Abram says, let's lie. Let's not trust God. Let's just lie. Problems happen. And the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, ends up saying, why in the world did you even lie to me? How dare you lie to me? And he sends him away. Abram moved without seeking God. Abram decided to lie about his wife and put their family in this horrible situation because he didn't trust God to protect him. Abram caused all kinds of trouble and strife and future conflict between Egypt, and he was kicked out of Egypt. Why? Because he had no faith. He didn't trust God. It certainly doesn't seem that he had faith right at that moment. As I read this, it seems like he got impatient with God and he decided to do it on his own power. How many times do we do that? How many times do we say, you know what, God, you're not working fast enough. I'm going to take care of this on my own. And we do it on our own power, and we may think it's better. We may think this is going to work. In fact, there might even be a time where it's working. I'm sure Abram was sitting there, and the Pharaoh was giving him all this stuff, and Abram was like, boy, this worked out perfectly. But all we do when we do it on our own is cause more problems and more hurt and more trouble. So they get kicked out of Egypt. We're going to go to chapter 13 now. So Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife and everything that he had, and Lot went with him. Abram had become very wealthy in livestock and in silver and gold. And from the Negev he went from place to place until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai. Now, if that sounds familiar, it's because it's where his tent had been earlier and where he had first built an altar to the Lord. And then Abram, called on the name of the Lord. Abram leaves on his own, and guess where he ends back up? He ends back to where he was before. He ends back to the beginning. And in fact, it says that he finally gets back after all this trouble happened. He gets back, and it says he calls on the name of the Lord. You know, this is the first time we see Abraham calling on the name of the Lord since the last time, which I know doesn't make sense. But yeah, you know, like since earlier. He calls on the name of the Lord and he says, God, I messed up. God, I should not have gone down. I messed up. I'm sorry. God, I need you now. I realize, Lord, that I have gone down. I've taken the long way around, which actually we're going to talk about next week a little bit more. But I realize what I have done, and I am sorry, Lord. You know, my son plays basketball. And one of the things that you see a lot in basketball is when one of the players messes up, there's two things that they can do. They can mess up, like if they mess up a pass or do it, and they get really mad, like they blame it on someone else, like, oh, you know, like you should have been there instead of here. Or the ref calls something like, oh, you know, that's the worst call, ref, come on, you know, and all the parents are yelling at the ref and throwing things. Or they can say, every once in a while you see them go like this, my bad. Right, that one's on me. Like, I totally smacked that dude in the face. That one is on me. Or, you know what, I threw it over there when I should have thrown it there. That one is on me. And they own up to their mistake. My bad. Sometimes I think we need to take a note from those players where, you know, in life, when we make a mistake, we say, you know what, I messed up. My bad. My bad, God. I shouldn't have smacked that person in the face. My bad. Abram took the long way around. He detoured. He took around, and he gets back, and he says, and you know, it's how like my bad, God. My bad. How often do we go on our own and then be like, oh yeah, I forgot. God. I'm reading through a book. It's a really good book. It's called Pray First. And it was recommended to me, and I started reading it. And it's a reminder that, you know what, we need to pray first. Like we need to seek God first. Before we decide to go down to Egypt because there's a famine, maybe we should actually just seek God first. You know, the neat thing about this, though, is that as Abraham went down to Egypt, as Abraham decided to go on, you know, do his own thing, God was still with him. In fact, we find out a little later that God was even able to use his mistakes. And the most beautiful thing is that when Abram got back, God was ready for his return. It says Abram got back to this place and he sought God, you know, and he called on the name of the Lord, and God was right there saying, welcome back, thank you. So Abram gets back to trusting God. Abram is trusting God now. He calls on the name of the Lord, but then another problem arises. Here's the problem. It says, now Lot, remember his like adopted son, his nephew, who was moving about with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. But the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together. And quarreling arose between Abram's herdsmen and the herdsmen of Lot. The Canaanites and the Perizzites were also living in the land. So Abram said to Lot, let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herdsmen and mine, for we are brothers. Here's the next problem that happens. First, there's a famine. The next problem is he has too much money. So think, oh man, that wouldn't be a bad problem, right? They're too wealthy, and there starts to become fighting, and the herdsmen are like, hey, that's my sheep. And they're like, no, that's my sheep. And they start quarreling amongst each other. And Abram has this problem. He's like, okay, we don't want this fight. We can't survive together here. So Abram has a choice. They need to split up. That's the obvious answer. Lot, you need to take yours your way, and I need to go my way. And he has a choice to make. His choice is this. I can choose what land I'm going to go to, and Lot can go the opposite direction. Or I can let Lot choose which way he's going to go, and I will go the opposite direction. Now, tradition, it had been very common at this time, Abraham had the right to assign the land. In fact, at this time, Abram said, let's not fight, let's go different ways. And he could have said, Lot, you're going to go over there where the desert is, and over here where the Jordan River is, where it's just beautiful, I'm going to take that. Good luck. That would have been his right. But that's not what he does. He says in verse 9, he says, is not the whole land before you? He's talking a lot. Let's part company. If you go left, I'll go to the right. And if you go to the right, I'll go to the left. He says, Lot, I'm going to let you choose. Why? Why would he let Lot choose? Jesus says it this way, and he didn't have this teaching at this time, but Jesus says it this way. He says, the one who wants to be first must be a servant to all. The last of these. He says, love your neighbor as yourself. Abram at this point decided that it was best to become a servant to Lot. Even though he knew Lot was going to choose the best land, he decided that, Lot, I'm going to love you. I'm going to put my love for you above the love for myself. And I'm going to trust that God will honor the decision and provide for me. This is a complete turnaround from what had just happened. When there was famine, and Abram said, you know what, I'm going to just rely on myself, I'm going to trust myself, and I'm going to go. Now this time, there's this quarreling, and Abram knows that he's not going to get the land that God pointed out to him. And instead of lying, instead of manipulating, instead of trying to reverse psychology, saying like, Lot, I think that land's better. That's what we used to do with little kids, right? We'd have a nickel and a dime, and I'd trade my sister, I've got this little dime, or, I've got this big nickel and you've got this little dime. Don't you want the bigger one? And she would trade and I'd make 5 cents. Instead of doing that with Lot, he says, Lot, I'm going to let you choose. I'm going to let you choose. And don't miss this. The reason Abram was able to make this decision, the reason he was able to allow Lot to choose is because he trusted God to provide. He knew that there was nothing that was going to stop God's promise, and he says, if Lot chooses that way, you know what? God will take care of it. Well, guess what happens? Lot looked up and he saw the whole plain of the Jordan was well watered, and it was like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out towards the east. The two men parted company. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities and the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. In verse 14 it says, then the Lord said to Abram after Lot had parted from him, lift up your eyes from where you are and look north and south and east and west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go, walk through the land, the breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you. Abram trusted God, and God reaffirms his promise. Abram does the right thing, even when it was clearly not beneficial to him. And God said, good job, don't worry, I've got you. Every day we're faced with little decisions. Every day we're faced with problems. And the choices that we make in those problems, the choices that we make, whether to seek God and trust Him first, or whether we go out on our own and try to do it in our own power, makes a difference. The choices that we make in those problems tell our story on whether we trust God or we don't. Whether we trust God and we're open to the blessings that He lays out in store for us, or whether we trust ourselves and we try to do it on our own. We're going to have our worship team come forward. And this morning, as we look at Abram's life, this man of faith, we realize he wasn't perfect. He did things wrong. He made mistakes. Yet God was still with him. God still fulfills His promise. And that when we seek our Lord, when we seek His face and we put our faith in Him, that He will take care of us. And we can trust in Him. So this morning, let's stand and let's just finish worshiping.